Hi, everyone. My name is Robert Swinney, and I'm an associate professor at the Duke University Fuqua School of Business. In my research and teaching, I focus on operations and supply chain management. Now, to be honest, most of the time, that's a topic that doesn't generate a lot of interest from the general public. And I usually have to explain exactly what operations and supply chains are. But these days, when I tell people what I do, they all ask the same question: what is going on with the supply chain crisis? So that is exactly what I'm going to talk about today. My goal today is to give you a brief explainer on what is happening and why. And I promise to do this in plain English, no jargon, and no math. We're going to cover 4 topics over the next few minutes. The first is, what is the supply chain crisis? The second, what is causing it? The third, what is going to happen next? And the fourth, what can be done to prevent this in the future? Now, I'll answer questions at the end, so please feel free to send them in the chat throughout my talk, and then I'll get to them after I finish my prepared comments. Okay, we'll start with the first question. What is the supply chain crisis? We've all heard the stories: cars that can't be built because there aren't enough semiconductors, artificial Christmas trees that can't be sold because they're waiting to unload from a ship anchored off the California coast, home appliances that are waiting in warehouses at ports because there aren't enough trucks and drivers to ship them to stores, and shoe factories in Vietnam that have had to close due to COVID or a lack of workers, leading to fewer shoes on store shelves. Now, you may have heard people describe this as problems with the global supply chain. I don't really like that phrase. Saying the global supply chain is pretty misleading because there is not one single supply chain. There are many. And in fact, they aren't even really chains. They are complex networks or webs with many interdependencies at multiple levels. So reality is much more complicated than a single linear supply chain, both for good and for bad. It's not a simple chain, so a single link failing is not necessarily going to bring global commerce to a halt, but also there are a lot of links and their relationships are very complicated, and that brings many potential points of failure. Now, this is important because what we are seeing right now is not a singular crisis stemming from a narrow cause. It's not a single link that failed in a linear system. It is the response of a complex system to major changes in conditions. And this is stressing many different junctures in these complex supply networks in ways that would have been difficult, if not impossible, to predict just 2 years ago. So going back to the original question, what is the supply chain crisis? Well, it's exactly this: complicated global supply networks and logistics processes that are being simultaneously strained at many different points. Some supply chains are experiencing enormous surges in demand. Others are experiencing reductions in capacity due to COVID shutdowns or staffing issues, and still others are failing altogether due to a lack of components or raw materials. This causes shortages, long production and distribution lead times, and ultimately stockouts for consumers, even though global trade is happening at higher levels than ever before. So what exactly is causing the crisis? Now, this is something that we will be studying for a long time, so the answers are not entirely clear right now. But it appears that we're seeing shortages because of the combination of at least 3 reasons. The first is COVID-related disruptions to supply. The second is COVID-related distortions to demand. And the third is the fact that manufacturing and logistics systems are normally designed to run at a high utilization. So let me walk through each one of these. First, COVID-related disruptions to supply are when we see plant or port shutdowns due to surging COVID cases, mitigation policies, or difficulty in hiring or retaining workers due to the tumultuous labor market. So this has the effect of decreasing capacity in a supply chain. Second, COVID-related distortions to demand are the result of changes in customer purchasing behavior due to the pandemic. Demand for some items has skyrocketed. Consumers have spent a lot of their money on physical goods rather than services, and this leads them to purchase in ways that are inconsistent with past data and that caught manufacturers and retailers off guard. This has the effect of increasing demand in a supply chain in a way that wasn't forecasted. So you have a simultaneous reduction in capacity and increase in demand. And that might be fine, except for one thing. Manufacturing and logistics systems, things like factories, ports, and trucking capacity, are very expensive. Because they're so expensive, they're normally designed to run at a high utilization. That means they don't have a lot of excess capacity, because if they did, it would be very wasteful in terms of resources, money, and the environment. And everything we buy would cost more. Because they run at a high utilization, they're busy most of the time. And while most supply chains can handle modest fluctuations in demand or capacity, when they face significant simultaneous decreases in capacity and increases in demand, they will become overloaded very quickly. An overloaded system rapidly builds a backlog. As I tell my MBA students, queues, or backlogs of work, explode in a highly nonlinear way as the utilization of a system gets really high. So in many supply chains, the situation looks something like this. You have a system that was normally designed to run without a lot of spare capacity. Let's say capacity is up here and demand is down here, and it simultaneously experiences a 10% reduction in capacity and a 10% increase in demand. Right? So once the utilization of the system gets very high, say in the 90% range or higher, queues start to rapidly build just due to natural variability. But when the utilization crosses 100%, it gets even worse. Queues will grow indefinitely until capacity and demand are brought back into balance. And because this is happening not at one link in the supply chain, but at multiple points, bringing supply and demand back into balance is very hard to do quickly. All steps in the supply chain need to be examined, and potentially bottlenecks need to be alleviated. The problems at ports are great examples of this. Now, I'm sure you've seen countless news stories about the line of ships waiting to unload off the California coast. Now, you might see that line of ships and think, well, they need to unload the ships faster, so they need more unloading capacity, things like cranes. But in fact, the ships can't unload because the yards are full and there's nowhere to put the containers. And that may lead you to think they need more places to put containers. Well, they could add storage capacity for containers, but then you're just changing from containers waiting on ships to containers waiting in a storage yard. The problem is that containers are moving out of the storage yards too slowly. So, okay, that sounds like they need more trucks to pick up the containers and remove them from the yards faster. But there seem to be a lot of trucks and drivers. It turns out that a lack of chassis to hold the containers is preventing them from picking up goods. Where are the chassis? A lot of them are holding containers waiting to load onto ships. So I just described 4 or 5 steps in this process, and each one seems like it's the bottleneck, but on closer examination, they all seem to be waiting on something else. That's because port logistics processes consist of multiple tightly interconnected steps. Once the whole system is very highly utilized, above 100% in this case, each one potentially is a bottleneck. And as you try to add capacity at any one step, the bottleneck will shift to another step. This means increasing the flow through ports is going to be an iterative process that takes a while. A bottleneck needs to be fixed, and that will immediately expose another bottleneck, which then needs to be fixed, and so on. It takes time, careful analysis, and cooperation by all the different stakeholders in this process to accomplish. Anyone who has an MBA should recognize this, because what's happening at the ports right now is actually identical to what happened in the most famous operations case study of all time, the National Cranberry case, studied by generations of students. In that case, trucks are waiting to unload cranberries at a processing plant, just like we have ships waiting to unload containers at ports today. Also in that case, everyone thinks the bottleneck is capacity to unload the trucks or to store the berries after they've been unloaded. But in fact, it's a step way down the line in the process that dries wet cranberries. And the solution in the case is to sequentially add capacity in the right places as the bottleneck shifts. This is what we need to do for our overloaded ports. Now, something I want to stress is that what we are seeing is not necessarily the result of a failure or bad decisions on the part of the companies that are experiencing shortages. Pre-COVID, many companies did think somewhat about supply chain disruptions, but in a more narrow sense. They thought about mitigating the risk of events like floods, earthquakes, or wildfires that might affect one specific geographic region at a time. A key problem that we're seeing right now is disruptions are happening everywhere at the same time in a very correlated way, combined with surging demand. This is not something supply chains were designed to withstand because, frankly, this kind of large-scale event seemed very unlikely. So what's going to happen next? Well, short-term predictions are difficult, but long-term predictions are a little bit easier. The most important thing to understand is that these shortages are definitely not here to stay, because companies will increase capacity to meet surging demand, short-term supply disruptions will dissipate, and demand will probably moderate as well, especially after the holidays. It'll take time and investment, but the combination of these things means that customers will see increased product availability once again in the near future. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that things will return to normal pre-pandemic business as usual anytime soon. Demand for many products was depressed during the early stages of the pandemic, and this caused many companies to reduce capacity or inventory. Now, as we near recovery, we're seeing surging demand for many products because purchases were postponed and all of that pent-up demand is now starting to materialize. Companies that had reduced capacity are now seeing increased demand, and they're scrambling to increase capacity and sourcing quantities from their suppliers. And these kind of patterns lead to something that my MBA students over the years should know well, the bullwhip effect. This is a phenomenon that has been researched for decades. In short, what it means is that supply chains tend to amplify demand variability as you go up the chain. This happens because of the ways that information is shared and delayed in supply chains and the ways firms respond to changing demand conditions. One simple way this can happen is like this. Imagine a retailer sees demand increase 10% for a product and, anticipating continued growth, inflates its orders with suppliers not by 10%, but by 15%. Now the supplier sees a 15% increase in retailer orders and also anticipating further growth, inflates its orders with its suppliers not by 15%, but by 20%. This pattern can repeat at each link in the supply chain until at the very end of the chain, firms are thinking there's an enormous swing in demand. It's called the bullwhip effect because if you imagine cracking a whip, you move your wrist just a little bit, but the end of the whip moves a huge amount. The same thing happens in supply chains. As consumer demand varies a bit, compounding amplification of that variation causes firms to see bigger and bigger swings the deeper into the supply chain you go. And this causes firms to scramble to build massive inventory and capacity to meet what is apparently a huge demand surge. But then in the end, consumer demand really did only go up 10%. And now there is a ton of extra inventory and capacity in the system. Because of this, one very important thing we know about the bullwhip effect is that following periods of massive shortages, as suppliers in the network scramble to adjust, you subsequently have periods of massive excess inventory and capacity. That is, the system overcorrects for shortages. It's quite possible that something like this will happen in the next year. And while I think we will see continued shortages in the short term, say at least 6 months, following this, I would not be surprised to see exactly the opposite situation to what we have now. Some supply chains with far too much capacity or inventory sitting around because of overcorrection. This has its own problems, as you can imagine. So ultimately, the disruptions we're seeing clearly need to be fixed and supply restored. But in the race to fix our supply chains, we need to beware the other end of the bullwhip. Some companies may already be anticipating this and as a result are hesitant to invest in increased capacity. To avoid either overinvestment or overly cautious investment, the real key is to make sure accurate information regarding retail demand is being conveyed to firms deeper in the supply chain. That is, to avoid over-ordering and duplicate ordering so that we don't overcorrect for these disruptions while still building the necessary capacity to meet growing global demand. Okay, so time for the last topic. What can companies do to prevent this in the future? Well, the good news is that a lot of very smart supply chain researchers have studied ways to insulate supply chains against disruptions, and this has been a growing area of research for at least 15 years. A great example of this is my colleague Yehua Wei at Duke, who has done outstanding prize-winning work in this area. There are a lot of solutions out there, but a key element in most of these solutions is understanding the level of risk so you can appropriately invest to mitigate that risk. Current events have shown us that the risk is higher than many thought possible. Now that we know this, companies need to reevaluate their disruption mitigation strategies and most likely be prepared to invest more in resilience. So at least in the near term, I expect companies to exhibit renewed vigor in applying some of the resilience measures that we have already developed with updated estimates of the risk they're exposed to. Some of the most effective disruption mitigation strategies that we know of include sourcing from multiple suppliers in diverse locations, having some excess or backup capacity that can be brought online quickly, and holding inventory as safety stock. And while people often look to inventory first, this is not the only solution. It's one part of a portfolio of solutions, and it needs to be used carefully and selectively in concert with other strategies. Another important part of this is supply chain mapping, especially beyond Tier 1. While most companies know their immediate Tier 1 suppliers, many don't know their suppliers' suppliers, so that's Tier 2 and beyond. I expect companies to put more effort and resources into mapping their supply chains to better understand exactly where they're exposed to risk, and this, in turn, can help inform more effective mitigation efforts. Now, longer term, while I don't think we will see total reshoring of supply chains en masse, I think we will see more multi-sourcing with a combination of local and distant suppliers. One of the most important things we're learning through all of this is that your supply base is not really diversified if, say, you have 2 suppliers from the same province in China. They will share the same power grid, the same logistics capacity, and often the same sub-suppliers. True diversification in a supply base requires suppliers that are truly independent from one another. For example, a supplier in China and a supplier in the US, which use completely different infrastructure to produce and distribute products. Sourcing strategies like this are more diversified in terms of risk and give you some of the cost benefits of offshore suppliers and some of the flexibility and robustness of nearshore suppliers. In fact, one of the interesting things we know about supply chain sourcing is that using multiple suppliers intelligently can give you lower total costs than using any single supplier. I suspect companies will be more open to this kind of thinking going forward, given that the past year has made very clear how risky it can be to rely solely on distant, fully offshore supply. Another key thing that we're learning is that shared infrastructure, things like shipping containers and ports, trains and trucks, that are common to many types of goods, need more flexibility and more capacity to increase reliability. Shared infrastructure represents a potential bottleneck for all supply chains at once. While individual companies are responsible for diversifying their own supply bases, investing in this type of shared resource requires more coordination and effort from multiple stakeholders, including companies and governments. The pandemic has exposed, my light flipped off. The pandemic has exposed the criticality of this type of infrastructure. Bigger picture, I think that designing even more robust and resilient supply chains, ones that can handle the kind of large-scale event that we've just experienced in a cost, resource, and environmentally efficient way, is going to be a key focus of both researchers and companies alike going forward. So to end on an optimistic note, to me, that makes this an exciting space to work in the next decade. We have an opportunity to rethink supply chains and to make them stronger for customers, companies, workers, and people all over the world. Okay, so that concludes the prepared portion of my talk. I hope you all enjoyed the discussion. I'm now happy to take any questions that you might have. Okay, and so I guess we don't have any questions yet. I'm going to head off the most common question that I often get when talking about this with people, and that most common question is just-in-time production to blame for all of this? And yeah, so one business practice that often gets blamed for this crisis is this idea of just-in-time production or lean manufacturing, right? So that is the practice of operating a supply chain with minimal inventory. And it's easy to see why this receives a lot of the blame. If you have minimal inventory and production or supply are disrupted for some period, you'll have nothing to sell. So it would seem that companies that choose to operate lean supply chains, they set themselves up for this situation, right? So pretty straightforward, right? Well, not so fast. What's often lost in this critique is recognition of the benefits of just-in-time production. Just-in-time helps significantly reduce cost and also increase the quality of manufacturing processes. Without lean or just-in-time, things we buy would cost more and have lower quality. And on top of this, carrying a lot of inventory is also a risk. While we're currently seeing demand surges, demand could just as easily drop due to a crisis as it did early in the pandemic for many products, leaving companies with massive excess inventory, which is bad from a cost and environmental perspective. So in other words, while you may think a lean supply chain is risky, carrying a lot of inventory can be equally risky. And even if companies carried more inventory, could they have completely avoided the current crisis? Well, that's very unlikely unless the quantity of inventory they carried was enormous, big enough to cover the prolonged nature of the current situation. So even if that were the case, companies would still face delays and shortages due to constrained logistics and distribution capacity, this shared infrastructure I talked about earlier. So just carrying more inventory, just being less lean, it may have helped a bit with the current crisis, but on its own, it would not be enough to avoid a crisis like this. And it would come with its own significant cost and risk. What is clear is that having more capacity for production, and even more importantly for logistics and distribution, would have helped significantly with the current crisis. And while it's easy to say that in hindsight, going forward, the most important thing to do is modify our supply chains to keep all of the good things about just-in-time production, lower cost and higher quality, less inventory waste, while also making them flexible enough to reroute or scale up quickly if needed. Okay, so I have another question from the chat now. This is from Doug, who's an alum. And the question is there a role a central authority can play to help mitigate the current crisis? Yeah, and so is there a role? That's a great question. I think there is a role. I think most of it has to do with coordination around shared infrastructure, as I alluded to earlier. Really, there's two things we need to do in the wake of this crisis. We need to have short-term efforts to increase the immediate flow of products and long-term efforts to make supply chains more resilient. And so I think there can be help from a central authority around coordinating both of those things, especially around shared infrastructure, things like ports and distribution systems. Okay, no other questions yet. I have another question from Syed. How does bundling as one of the previous practice strategies fit into this new normal while mitigating supplier risk versus cost optimization? So I'm not sure if I entirely understand the question, but what I'll say is that, look, so there's a portfolio of strategies that we know of that can help mitigate the kinds of disruptions that we are currently seeing. And I think the biggest issue is not that the portfolio of strategies that we have available to us, like the toolkit that we have, the problem is not that we have a bad toolkit, it's that the level of risk and the degree of correlation in risk that we're currently seeing was not anticipated beforehand. So I think the biggest thing that we need to do is continue to use the same tools in our toolkit that we have to mitigate disruption risk, but to reevaluate the probability of those disruptions happening now, to raise them, to make them a little bit higher, and to adjust our strategies into taking all of that into account. There's a question from Roy, an alum, and it says, do you predict a retreat from use of non-US suppliers due to ongoing issues? So as I kind of alluded to in the prepared portion of my comments, I don't expect a complete retreat from this or even a very major retreat, but I would not be surprised to see more nearshoring as a part of multi-sourcing strategies. You don't necessarily need to have a US supplier to insulate against this risk. You can have a supplier maybe that's located in North or South America that's a little bit closer and diversified from risk from, say, like a supplier in Asia, right? So I expect to see more diversity in suppliers, not a wholesale switch to using only US suppliers. I think that also has risks. If you put all your eggs in one basket, it doesn't matter whether the basket is in Asia or in the US, that's going to be pretty risky. So what I expect to see is more diversification and using suppliers in different geographic locations at the same time. A question from one of my former students that I recognize and know very well, Pasha. He says, do you anticipate governance within large economic blocs, for example, the EU, to provide investment into port logistics efficiency initiatives to protect against shocks? I absolutely expect to see that, and I hope to see that. I think what we're seeing is that this is a resource that no one company is responsible for. And in fact, different localities are responsible for different ports. Ports in the US are kind of controlled by the city or the state, but they affect everyone. Even though these resources like specific ports may be controlled by one entity, they affect all firms that route their supply chains through that port. They affect all customers in the country, throughout the United States. And so what that means is, we kind of need greater investment and greater kind of collaboration to help ensure the resilience of those resources. Another question from an alum that I recognize and had as a student in the past, Chase. Chase says, what are ways that companies are looking to increase capacity? Obvious ways include hiring more people, running additional shifts, overtime, building factories, buying machinery, increasing tech capabilities and automation. Are there others? No, I think you hit the you hit the main ones. I think another thing that you could do is find some outsourced capacity to use. Under normal operating conditions, that's a pretty good strategy for increasing capacity quickly, finding outsourced production capacity. One of the reasons we're struggling right now is because of the global demand surge all at once. Everybody's kind of short on capacity, right? So kind of the normal strategies that you would use to get emergency supply, to have extra capacity and to satisfy more demand are harder to use right now because there's just such a sort of coordinated global surge in demand all at once. And this means there's not a lot of excess or spare capacity out there that's available for you to use. But I think, Chase, you hit the kind of the main ways to increase capacity. I do expect to see more effort and investment into automation because this is a way that's kind of, besides having lower labor requirements and given the tumultuous labor market, it's a way to kind of scale production pretty quickly and without having to hire additional people to increase capacity. So I would not be surprised to see among all of those strategies that Chase mentioned, a big investment into automation going forward. A question from Sanjay: how about the pharma sector, where supply disruption and penalties are common due to sudden surge in seasonal or unforeseen demand? What can be done in such cases? Yeah, the pharma industry, Sanjay, is particularly difficult particularly because of the long lead times of production for many pharmaceutical products. And so this is, short of having excess capacity, there's not a lot that you can do, I think, in the pharma industry. So that's an interesting one. I think you raise a good point. I don't know the answer to your question there. We'll see how that one unfolds. Another question from Michael: what will be some leading indicators we should look for that signal solutions are having an impact? One of the ones that people are looking out for constantly is a reduction in container shipping fees. I think that's already started to happen a little bit, or at least a few days ago, there were some indications that container shipping fees were starting to go down. I wouldn't be surprised to see that, honestly, just due to seasonality at this point, because we're kind of past the point where if you want to ship something, it's going to get here in time for the holiday season. And the holiday season is a big driver of seasonality and container shipping costs. But looking beyond that, if it continues to dip, I think that would be a sign that things are starting to reach some kind of equilibrium in terms of global supply and demand. Another question from Nasser: do you think different parts of the supply chains, suppliers, manufacturers, retailers, etc., make more money because of the crisis? If so, what kind of incentives are there for them to fix the issue? Nasser, that is a fantastic question. Okay, so do people make more money because of the crisis? In a narrow sense, I think there are some parts of the supply chain that make more money because of the crisis. Shipping lines and shipping container companies are one great example of this. Because everybody wants to use all of these ships and all of these containers, they're able to really raise their prices a lot. So they're making a lot more money, and they're reporting kind of record profits. Now, you say, what incentives are there for them to fix the issues? I think it's a very narrow view for them to look at this and say, it worked out great for us, so we shouldn't have more capacity, because they could have made even more money if they'd actually had more ships and more containers and more ports, more port capacity to kind of unload those ships. So it's kind of a narrow view to say that they don't need to do anything to fix it. And I hope they look at this and realize there are real costs. There are also opportunity costs. The opportunity cost of not having enough capacity here, I think, was pretty big for a lot of companies. Another question from Susan: do you see port infrastructure as being part of the cause of the supply chain issue? If so, can it be fixed? Yeah, so I think port infrastructure, it was clearly a part of the issue. It's not the only issue by far, and I want to emphasize that. I mentioned at the beginning, this isn't reflective of one link in the supply chain failing. There are many different links that potentially failed, but port infrastructure was part of it, and I think it can be fixed. Again, there are multiple steps in the port process and logistics process, and all of these have to be addressed, so there's not like one easy solution here, but I think it's going to require a lot of investment and a lot of spending, but they can be fixed. Last question from Lu Yi Han, a current student: how can a company mitigate potential political risks in the supply chain, given that the macro trend is long-term, but the near-term policies could fluctuate? Lu Yi, that's a fantastic question. I think, once again, going back to what I said earlier, if we're looking at just what companies can do, I think a real key here is going to be diversifying supply chains, right? Not moving them all to one geographic region, not moving them all back to the US, but having a diversity of sources that let your product flow through different regions. And that really helps diversify against political risk. Okay, so I am out of time for now. Thanks everyone again for coming. Fuqua faculty hold conversations live on LinkedIn on the first and third Wednesday of each month at 12:30. So in 2 weeks on December 1st, Grania Fitzsimmons is going to be next. She's going to share insights from her research about motivation, and I hope you all join. Thanks and bye.